I believe that you should really get Hello World working. Whatever framework or tool you're using, get Hello World working, then get your CI running and just get to build your Hello World.
Hi, my name's Eddie and we're here at Web Engineering 2019 in the lovely Palma, Mallorca, Spain. We've met so many amazing people. The Dashboard Hub team have really been speaking to everyone and has really got stuck in and helped out, and people have already asked if they're going to come next year, so it's been great. An Unconference is where there's no planned talks. People turn up on the day and propose talks they would like to give. So it was really interesting. It was so good and so many great talks, and we videoed them. Subscribe to my channel below so when the videos do come out from the talks, you get notified of those videos. It wasn't just about coding, it was also about soft skills, a whole variety. Body language, how to present at a talk, how to present at a meeting, how you can change your coding to reduce the impact on climate change. So tech is for everyone, tech is for you.
So I'm keen to talk about the pipeline-driven development, talk about test-driven development and PDD, behavior-driven development, loads of great things. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to having your pipeline correct and perfect. And what I mean by that is, before you start writing any code, I believe that you should really get Hello World working. Whatever framework or tool you're using, get Hello World working, then get your CI running and just get to build your Hello World. And then why not, you could add a test to test your Hello World, be it Cypress or whatever you're using, Cypress, Angular, Cypress, and Firebase are the examples I'm going to use here. And then you can do your CD part, and then you can have it deploy out. And then you can start adding all the fun stuff and all the extra value add that you want to do. And these can be applied to anything. So like I said, I'm picking these three as an example here, but it can be applied to anything. Anyone thinking what Code Mortals is, it's just another YouTube channel I've started with a friend of mine to do more coding and live streams and tech stuff. So by all means, please do follow that as well. So I'm going to skip over Angular, to be honest, because there's whole React and Vue conversations, but this can be applied to anything. So I'm going to skip all over how. But the bottom line is, get Hello World working in whatever tool you're using. It's really important to get that rapid feedback from day one, not later on. It's so much more costly. The amount of projects I've worked on when people say, we haven't got any automation, it takes too long to do. Well, if you do it from the beginning, it won't take too long and you'll think more about it. I mean, who here is doing continuous integration? Most people, I like to think. So yeah, that's pretty good. And the ones who aren't, is that because the project's more of a legacy project, or you don't think it adds value? And what are the reasons why you're not doing CI? The rapid feedback's really important. I think someone mentioned earlier on when we were planning these talks, that the build sometimes takes longer, deployment suddenly starts taking longer, and the automated tests take longer. We don't know about this until like a year or two later, and suddenly it's gone from taking 10 minutes to build, suddenly taking 4 hours, 12 hours overnight, and no one knows what has happened. It's just over time it's taken longer. And that's normal. It will take longer as you add more tests, add more code, add more tooling to your CI. You could add accessibility testing, pen testing, load testing. I mean, there's a whole raft of things you can add to it, which we'll go into, which is great. So these will add more time, but you know you've added something to add more time. Like if you did a big epic or a feature, right, you've got 10 more tests, okay, it's going to take 30 seconds longer to build. But over a year or two, you don't know what might be having an effect. I've seen projects that have like, I don't know, 100 meg image file that then no one realized got put in and got skipped and so forth. Circle CI, I just want to show how really simple it is. Travis CI is even simpler to use. There's no downside to having it. And continuous delivery, just releasing to a production-like environment or a production environment with serverless, which we're going to go into and I'm really keen to get into, and I'm sure you all are as well. You can do a production environment because it's so easy to spin up, and we'll drill more into that. But having that confidence to know that it's deployed, it's worked, your tests have passed, all the other extra automations running on CI have passed, it's deployed, you can maybe manually do some checks, some sanity checks, make sure it's okay, I think is really important. So CD, I really believe, is part of the CI process. And yes, you only run it for certain branches. I have worked on a project where it was a fintech in London, and they were so adamant about belt and braces, or maybe a bit, we say OTT, like over the top, that they wanted every branch, every feature branch to get deployed to a production-like environment. So we were using AWS, And so we had CloudFormation. I know someone mentioned Puppet. So we're using CloudFormation, and every feature branch got built an entire production environment, and it only took about 30 minutes. That was including load balancing, including databases, including CDNs. I know someone else has mentioned that as well. CloudFront on AWS, clearing all the cache across the globe. We ran the entire thing. 30 minutes to build the environment. It would run all the tests, and then people could then decide if they wanted to manually check it. When that pull request got reviewed and merged in, the whole environment got torn down and deleted. So it was a fully encapsulated. Even subdomains got built. So if your branch was issue-123, then you could go to that environment on issue-123 dot the name of the bank. It was really, really nice to have that automation, have that confidence. So it's really, really good. Enables change. I think people are always scared of change because they're like, oh, what's it going to affect? Is this going to work? Have it built, give it to someone, so look, do whatever testing you want, and give them that confidence. Coming into Firebase, getting a pipeline set up should take less than 30 minutes and probably even 10. So there's no reason not to set up a full pipeline before you start your project. I mean, this is going to CI, saying we only want to deploy for this branch, we want to deploy to that environment, and then for production. And all the other ones, yes, it'll still run the tests, but it won't deploy it out. And then automation testing, I mean, I won't go into detail, but we use Cypress for the UI, and we also use Cucumber on Cypress, if people are familiar with that, and we use that for our API tests as well. Cucumber has a commonality between the front end and the back end. And with Cypress, we usually mock everything out on the UI, not everything, most things, and then we have some going all the way through to the API. So like login, for example, on most tests, you're going to have to be a logged in user. So there's no point testing the full end-to-end every time, because you need to test it once or twice with some boundary conditions, failing, etc., all the way to the database and back. The rest of the time you can mock it out and make your test so much faster. So in our current fintech we're working at, we can run the entire test suite. I think our API has almost 1,000 tests, same with the UI, and the whole thing runs in about 10 minutes.
My question is basically, where precisely is the cut when you say you mock your UI? Do you also mock out most of the front-end logic, or do you just say every request that gets sent gets a predefined response so that you can then check your front-end logic against a predefined response? Or how do you do that?
But for a login example, we'll have a successful login to go all the way through to the back end and then come back in. Wrong username or email address, whatever it is, wrong password, etc. If those boundary conditions. So you might have 6 or 8 that go all the way through and come all the way back. And then the rest of them, for login, that use login, we will mock that out. So it'll have a successful user.
Oh, so you mean you tell the backend that the user is successfully logged in, not that you play through all the steps?
So with Cypress, we can mock out any requests that go to the backend after that. So in our Cucumber test, which I'll give an example, we can say, given I'm logged in with, and we'll know that will return on the Cypress mocking out the API call, the HTTP request, it will return a successful user. Well, when we come to some examples, if it doesn't make sense or I didn't answer it, then please do ask again. Let me jump to Cucumber. So you can make it as flexible as you want. So where you have the quotes, you can change that to login, account, etc., and so forth. But we have this on the front end and the back end. So a lot of our tests on the front end marry up to the tests on the back end. But what's behind it will be slightly different. For example, when you can say, when the username field is set to that, you can do that for the API. You can say, create a request that has this. And then login button isn't clicked. You'd say, when I post to, so we sometimes generalize this a lot more. This is specifically for the UI. But if we generalize it a lot more, the step definition behind it will be doing something different. It'll be doing a HTTP request rather than actually kind of doing something on the page. But the beautiful thing is this bridges the gap between everybody within the core team and the wider team. I hate saying tech and non-tech because we're all involved in tech in some way or another. So given, when, then, and then you get the ands in between. We can reuse this a lot. So the given login page is open, if we focus on the UI for the moment, we can reuse that everywhere. There's no copy and paste of test code. We can use that absolutely everywhere. Given I'm on, given the contact page is open, given whatever it is, you can change it. So the reuse becomes beautiful. So if you ever want to make an improvement to that test, you don't have to change it everywhere. Kind of Gherkin syntax, that line is in one place, and we could improve that test, and whenever it goes to a page, that test is now improved throughout the whole code base. Like I said, we have 1,000 tests currently on our current project. Imagine making a change, and most tests might have given I'm logged in, then you'd have to change that everywhere. So this gives you that extra level of abstraction. And there are other design patterns you can use for abstraction in the standard way of doing tests, like page object models and all those things, but I won't go into that now. But hopefully that clears up the Cucumber kind of side, so it's your tests written in English. But behind it, I think we have an example. It's a regex. It will get the given part, it will match the text and the variable in there. You can pass it in and you can actually do some actual coding to run the step definition. But it's really collaborative. We find we're able to give that to the product owner, we're able to give that to other people, they can all get involved. Even in some projects we've worked in, we've had it where the product owner wants to make a change. Say like after you log in, you don't go to the profile page, you go to, I don't know, the dashboard page. Some product owners or business analysts, however your structure is, they will raise an issue, you'll talk about it in sprint planning, and it takes ages, and it takes weeks to kind of get in. Whereas some places, they'll say, look, I'll just raise a PR and I'll update the Cucumber test. The PR will fail, we'll make it pass, they can accept it, it's done. It's deployed to production. So the whole cycle becomes really lean. Automate everything, like put everything on your CI. We found doing deployments of serverless a lot easier because you can just create all the functions. Everyone know what serverless is? My explanation of serverless is there are no servers, it's magic. And I did see a sticker at FOSDEM earlier this year which says, maybe you remember it. It was not there is no computers. It's you're using other people's computers or something. Like it was just someone else's computer. Yeah. So it was quite funny. I really like it how you deploy a function. You're not trying to set up this whole, I don't know, bare metal server, or if you're using Puppet or Chef or Ansible or CloudFormation or any other things, you don't set up a virtual machine and then you assign a database to it or a database installed on it. It's just a function and you can scale it so much more. You don't think I need 4 gigs of RAM, 8 gigs of RAM. This function will run, and if you're using Firebase or AWS's Lambda, it guarantees that this function will run up to, I think most places up to 1,000 concurrently. And we've load tested that and that works out the box. And if you want more, you can ask for more and you can scale even further. But and the way the cost model works is you get charged for every time the function runs. So within a set amount of time. So I think on my best memory is AWS. I think you get 100 milliseconds. It charges you a unit for every 100 milliseconds each function runs. If it takes 50 milliseconds, it will still charge you for that unit. If it takes 200 milliseconds, then it'll charge you for 2 units. But you get like 1 million free units, so it takes a while to go through that, and the next million is like 4 cents or 20 cents or something like stupid. So you deploy this function, but it's great that you can then deploy a dev version of that function, a prod version of that function. I think it also versions that function for you, I think, if I remember correctly. Firebase does as well. I have to remember. But you're probably using GitHub with CI or something equivalent, so you could do the versioning yourself. So you deploy that function, it guarantees that it's going to run, and you want your function to do kind of one piece of work well, and it can call other functions to farm things off. So for example, rather than having a function live for a long period of time, if you're doing an image resize, rather than having one function do the image, the main image, do the smaller version, do the thumbnail, you have a kind of maybe a controlling function, is what they recommend. I don't know if it's always the best scenario. And then it will call another function that does the main image, another function that does so they can run all asynchronously in parallel. I've moved most of my projects and all my clients mostly moving over to serverless because you just have that scalability. It makes, as we were saying earlier on, it makes the whole sysadmin, DevOps, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't remove it, it just makes it, I think, easier. And then you can focus more on the automation side. But I'm quite keen to know what people's experiences with serverless is and what area they want to talk about. So, like I said, I love serverless and deploying to it. I think it's a lot easier. It deploys really fast, it's really quick. You can deploy an individual function. So if you want to update a function, you can deploy that individual function, which I don't recommend. I think you should use the tools that they give you for that platform, and you deploy the whole lot, and it knows, well, that function hasn't changed, I'm going to skip it and do nothing, rather than trying to micromanage things yourself. But I see you smiling in the corner, so I'm hoping you've got a question.
So what about caching mechanisms? How can you take that into consideration? Or do you have to plan your application that it is workable without any cache with performance implications?
That's a really good question. So I actually haven't had the need to do any caching at the moment. If I'm using Elasticsearch or MongoDB, it's actually scaled fine, or Firestore scales really well. hate DynamoDB that they recommend to use with Lambda. That's the weirdest database ever. But that's a different discussion. So I haven't needed to do that. But you're right. It makes me think of an issue. I can see a problem with caching. There's cold start issues with serverless. So if your function hasn't been called in, I can't remember what it is it an hour or something? Then it will go to sleep. And the next time it's called, it takes 300 milliseconds. Yes, it costs you a bit more. Or maybe even 800 milliseconds. Like it's under a second, but it takes longer to boot. Then it keeps that function in memory. And the next time it's really quick. So there are ways to go around that if that's a problem. And then before I go into that, I was going to say the other problem, downside with serverless, is if you're going to Mongo or you're going to caching server, it takes time for the first function to create the connection. So I have a friend who's using Mongo on, I think it's Cloud Atlas or something? I don't know, some Mongo provider. To make that connection, if you don't use it within an hour, it adds another second. So he's got maybe almost a second for the first function to run if it hasn't been used in an hour, and then a second on Cloud Atlas. So now he's got a 2-second cold start time. So that's really expensive. So then he does a ping every 30 minutes now to all his functions to keep them alive. I feel that's like an anti-pattern now. You're kind of, you've kind of moved to serverless, stateless, great, and now you're trying to use it in a different way.
You can never be sure if you don't get into the cold start problem, because when AWS, for example, upscales the function for horizontal scaling, then you get another cold start issue, even if you're calling the function every 30 minutes or so. You're never sure.
True.
You get the performance.
True, and each function is independent. So if you've got, say, 100 functions, each one has this problem. So there's the benefit of it being independent, but there's the downside. So AWS brought out an open source project, which is quite nice, which is using Express. So you can write your application in Express, which is great because then you can run it off serverless if you wanted to. It's just an Express app. But then you can deploy it, and it deploys in one function, and that function has different routes, and your Express app within that function deals with what function to run, which is really nice because then you get around the cold start problem, because there's not all the cold start problems, but going on the simpler side rather than the horizontal scaling, there's always, you're more likely to have, if you've got 100 functions, you're more likely to have one of your functions in that Express app be called in that 30 minutes or hour, whatever it is. But then your memory footprint's greater. So you're kind of maybe shifting the problem a little bit.
Why would you do that? Is there any use case for actually not using a server for that, but still using serverless services for that and doing that kind of workaround?
I think the pro that I see for doing that, it's not a silver bullet, is your listeners. So with the WebSockets, your listeners might be greater than so it's not a one-to-one. So for example, if you have 100 users using your application, for example, 10 of them might request the function, but 90 or 100 of them might actually be listening, and vice versa. Whereas if you've got it on a VM or a bare metal server, like in a traditional sense, then all that load is going into one place. So it might not be evenly distributed. I don't know if I'm explaining that right. As in, just because I'm doing something to action that function doesn't mean I'm waiting for the real time. There might be another 100 people waiting for the real time reply. So I think the positive of that is it can scale independently. AWS IoT can scale differently. Serverless functions could then scale differently, or they could scale greater as well, so independently.
So you mentioned this example of you have the upload of an image and the resizing. Those would be separate functions, right? There's one for upload. Would you then have one big repository with all your functions, or how do you, it kind of feels for me like it's going to be hard to find the code that is happening.
That's a really good question. There isn't so much a standard. So some people create their own file structure and they put, everything related to this, everything related to this is in here, like users or repositories or projects, whatever. But then you have some functions that might call from one and write to the other. So which one does it go in? And so there are challenges around that. And actually on Dashboard Hub, that is one challenge we're having at the moment. And we're going to restructure that after this event because that really bugged me. And yes, the structure becomes a bit more interesting. And I don't know the answer to this. I think the more I do it and as the project grows, I get more pain points. We might change it. And I'm sure again, 6 months later, we'll probably change it again. But being functions is quite good because you can literally rename the file and move it because everything for that function is in that one file. It's not like you've got everything, you've got this and you're calling a class and you're calling another function and you can't, if you move that, you need to update all the path. This function is self-contained. If I move the functions to make the folder structure easier to find, if it's calling that function, it's calling it on serverless rather than calling it within my code. So it will still work.
I think one challenge could also be lock-in effect, because serverless has a very, very huge vendor lock-in effect, and you can't just easily move stuff away from something. And especially with containers and Kubernetes, we kind of got away from the vendor lock-in of cloud providers a bit, and now with serverless, it feels like we're going more into vendor lock-in again. So that is also something to look out for. And maybe also in the future, there's probably going to pop up a few more projects that actually do this well within the standardized APIs.
Yeah, vendor lock-in is something I had to decide for Dashboard Hub, because I remember making it previous years really agnostic, but I never moved. So for me, I was like, vendor lock-in, I'm fine with it. It's okay. I'll deal with it. If I've got a problem where I want to scale it differently, I guess that's a good problem to have. You could use, like I said, the Express on serverless to try and movable, but it's a hard one. It's tough. You're right. You do get vendor lock-in.
No, it's not necessarily bad. It's just something to keep in mind.
Yes.
And we definitely also have a vendor lock-in by just having a database somewhere at a hoster. And if you ever have to move a few terabyte or petabyte of data to some other data center, that's going to be fun anyways. So you always have a vendor lock-in. It's just you have to know that.
You could also use a serverless framework, which helps you in order to deploy, to manage your serverless applications. And serverless framework, serverless.com, is capable to deploy serverless applications to AWS, to Azure, and to Google Cloud.
I do like the framework. I used it a lot when I was using AWS Lambda. It is really nice to give you that.
Can you also set up triggers and everything like that with it?
Yes, you can.
You
or you
can
could even
now.
use, instead of serverless framework, you could basically also use Terraform. But Terraform is not that, it's not built for serverless.
And the serverless framework brought out another framework which you could use in conjunction for the events. I can't think what it's called, but it's specifically designed for the event side of things. So you can do that. So, but like with every abstraction, there are benefits, but then there are downsides. So I think a friend of mine moved their project from Lambda to Azure, I think, using the serverless framework, and some functionality wasn't quite there. But the benefit was, so you're saying why? The benefit was the Azure serverless hosting. They could run that inside for development in-house, and it was the actual platform. So that was one of the reasons why they moved. Well, thank you very much. If anyone wants to see any code, I'm here all weekend, and we can actually show some code and so forth. So thank you very much. Cool. Cheers.